we are, well, I was about to say live, but I guess we'll be recorded when we finally show this. So we're with M.J.Evans. You are an author. You've written this wonderful book, True Story.
Let me
I just got done reading it. It is awesome. I very much enjoyed it. And so now we're going to hear about it. You've got a presentation. You're going to tell us about your inspiration and about this story.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Becca, for inviting me to share with you and your viewers the story of Pinto. If you're a horse lover or a history lover or just a book lover that loves an adventure, this is a book for you. I have stumbled across some interesting horses as I research for my blog that I write occasionally about famous horses. And I came across a little paragraph about Pinto, the horse that still holds the record for the longest horseback ride in history. And I became very curious to learn more. And I started online looking for sources of information. And I discovered that there wasn't a lot, but I did see on some of the old photo credits the name of the Western History Museum in Oklahoma City. And so I took a trip to that museum. And I went in the door and I asked to speak to the research librarian. And I told her that I wanted to see their materials on Pinto and the overland Westerners. She had no idea what I was talking about. But she went down to the basement, shuffled through boxes, and found an old dusty box of a whole collection of the old photographs that the overland Westerners took in front of the state capitals. She didn't even know they had these materials. Also in that box, there were some articles, some newspaper articles and things like that. So I got very excited going through all these photographs and reading the articles. And when I got home, I kept searching and I discovered that the little history museum up in Bainbridge Island, Washington, has a permanent exhibit of the overland Westerners. They consider them their hometown heroes. And so I went up to Bainbridge Island, Washington, and met with them, and they were so excited to have me there. I had called them ahead of time, and so they were all prepared. They had a table set up with a computer and flash drives. They had files of original articles and some photographs, and they had an assistant for me to make photocopies of whatever I wanted.
Wow.
I know, it was so great. It was an author's dream. But they also have as many of the original journals that two of the men kept that are still known to be in existence. And I got to see those actual journals, and they sent me home with the transcript from all of those journals. And it was that I used to put together the story of Pinto, primarily the journals, because often when I would read a newspaper article and then I would read the journal entry, they wouldn't always be the same. So if there was a discrepancy, I went with the journals because that's firsthand knowledge. They also ran into some journalists that weren't exactly honest with their story during their trip. So I went with the journals whenever there was a discrepancy. But there were gaps because there were some missing journals. So while the story is true in almost every sense, there were a couple of gaps that I had to fill in using my own creativity and own imagination. And one example of that would be in one newspaper article, the writer said that they had two of the 17 horses that they went through on this journey. Two of them died, but I didn't see anywhere in a journal entry that was recorded. So I made up 2 examples of realistic things. I had one horse die from colic, which all you horse people know that could very well happen.
Mhm.
And then I had one horse die from a rattlesnake bite when they were crossing from New Mexico to Arizona.
Mhm.
Called my vet and I said, so what would happen, if a horse was bitten by a rattlesnake and died? And they said, it's always on the nose. He said the horse hears the rattle or gets curious about a rustling in the bush, puts their nose down and gets bitten. And within minutes, the swelling starts, and pretty soon the horse can't breathe. So that was what I used for my 2 examples of how they could have died. Now, I mentioned that they went through 17 horses on this journey.
Yeah.
Only one horse made it the whole way, Pinto. So I have put together a little presentation for you on Pinto, and we're celebrating Pinto in this. And I want to tell you about a little bit about the story through this presentation. First of all, the whole story begins with the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal had actually been started in the 1800s to try to find a shortcut between the 2 oceans, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And at the time, the land that is now Panama was part of Colombia. But the
Mhm.
US government helped stage a coup, and the new country of Panama was formed. And the US took over the construction of the canal, and the planned Panama Pacific International Exhibition was being planned for the 1915 to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. The Panama Pacific International Exposition was going to be held from February 20th to December 4th, 1919. And it was going to be a great event. They were going to,
1815.
excuse me, 1915, what did I say? Sorry,
Oh yeah, you're at 19. That's okay.
1915. And they were going to have all of these wonders of the modern world. The first steam engine was going to be there. They were actually going to string a phone line from the East Coast to the West Coast. They were having the Liberty Bell being transported across the continent to be on display. So it was going to be a big to-do. Well, this was the inspiration for George Beck.
Mhm.
George Beck was the organizer of the Overland Westerners, the 4 men who rode their horses to every state capital in the Union. By 1912, there were 48 states because Arizona and New Mexico had just joined the Union. So George Beck decided that Panama Pacific International Exposition was going to be his pot of gold, that people were going to be flocking to them to see these 4 men who had ridden around every state capital, and that they'd become rich and famous. Well, this George Beck on Pinto. And as you can see, he looks pretty fancy sitting on that cute.
Mhm.
Well, so this idea was all his brainchild, and he recruited his brother, his brother-in-law, and his friend. Now, George Beck had been a lumberjack up in Washington State. Now, lumberjacks have a pretty rough job, and it's not very consistent employment. In the winter, the mountains are covered with snow, and in the summer, they're often having to deal with forest fires. And so he wasn't very happy being a lumberjack, but he did love to ride. So he came up with this idea, talked his brother-in-law, and friend into joining him. And on May 1st, 1912, they left Washington State and wrote a little hamlet in Washington State, where they had been preparing, and they rode to Olympia, Washington, where they had their first meeting with the state governor, took their first set of photographs, and rode off heading towards Salem, Oregon. Now, this was an expensive endeavor for them to do, and they had initially lined up a sponsor. There was a magazine in Seattle, and they agreed to sponsor them, that if they would sell subscriptions to the magazine as they traveled around, they would get that money. Well, that worked a little bit while they were in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, even Montana, people who were interested in the Northwest. But within a year, the magazine folded, and there went that source of income. They had also printed postcards with their pictures, and they printed a calendar. And you can see a picture of their calendar in the slide. And this was what they intended to use to make money to finance their journey around the country. They ended up spending $9,000, which in those days was a lot of money.
Yeah.
But they starved most of the time, but they always took care of their horses. The horses never went without. If they needed new shoes, or they needed tack repaired, or they needed a place to stay, the horses got taken care of first. So we know that they were true horsemen. Now, I mentioned their second stop was Salem, Oregon. It took them approximately 10 days to get there. And they met with Governor Oswald West on May 11th, 1912. So here they are. These are the kinds of pictures that I would look through and see them in front of the state capitals. However, you will notice there weren't a lot of cheering crowds. And you'll see this picture, followed by this picture in Idaho. This governor, by the way, they'd been warned about, was an infamous horse trader. And he would, and he would want Pinto, so don't let him have Pinto. And you'll see in this picture, also no crowds, but Pinto at this point, the beginning of their trip, was used as a pack. But it wasn't long before he became George Beck's favorite horse. And when they had to cut expenses, they had to cut down to 4 horses and have the horses that they were using for riding double as pack horses as well. Here's a picture of one of the many failures. Now, in this picture, you see a dog. That dog's name is Nip. They adopted that dog when they were in Eastern Oregon. Actually, Nip adopted them.
Yeah.
Nip decided he wanted to come along. So Nip's owner said, fine, who am I to stand in his way of becoming famous? So Nip joined them. Nip came in handy sometimes because he would actually hunt and bring in rabbits for food sometimes. He would also get stepped on a lot and end up limping behind the rest of them. But Nip made it the whole rest of the way along with Pinto. So he started in Eastern Oregon and went the rest of the journey with them. Well, failure in Boston. They're in Boston now, September 20th, 1913. And the Overland Westerners did kind of a zigzag route, and I'll show you the map in a minute. But they would head up north when it was warmer weather, and then head back down to the south when it started to turn colder. Now, Boston on the East Coast gets a lot of rain, even in the fall. And they waited for days. This governor kept putting them off and putting them off and putting them off. And finally, they had an appointment, and it rained. You can see it's just pouring down on these horsemen and their dog. But the governor didn't show up because he didn't want to get wet. So some of their pictures, the governor wouldn't would send a secretary or someone else to take the picture, they had very little response from the governor in terms of being willing to get their pictures taken with them. The governors weren't very cooperative. In Boston, they just decided we better just take a picture and get out of here. So they
Mm-hmm.
have governor substitute in this picture. Here's Colorado, December 29th, I think it was 1914. They had their picture taken in Colorado. So all of you Colorado people should recognize that picture. They were obviously, because it's December, heading south at this point, heading toward New Mexico. Now here's a picture of their map. And you'll see in the, well, I'm looking at the screen, it's in my upper left corner. That's where they started, up in Washington. And they, you can see they went across the northern states during that summer. And then they headed back down for the winter, down toward Florida. Then they worked their way back up north. Then they zigzagged back down again. So you can see the crazy route they took. This route was 20,000 miles in length. And they ended up right on time, right on time. June 1st was their target date, 1915, and they rode into the Panama Pacific International Exposition right on time. However, they were expecting cheering crowds and ticker tape parades and maybe marching bands to welcome them. And nothing was there to greet them. The only greeting they got was someone yelling at them to get them nags off the street. So you think, well, why didn't anybody care? You know, now it would probably be kind of a cool thing. Somebody could, they could wear GoPros on their cowboy hats, and they could have a YouTube channel, and they could get lots of followers and maybe even get sponsors. But then not so much. And what little publicity they were able to get from local newspapers was sparse and obviously not very impressive to anyone. And I thought, well, timing is everything. And you think, what was going on at that time? Well, this picture will show you part of what I see as the problem. I love this picture. You'll see the Overland Westerners on my right, lower right, and you see Nip laying on the ground in front of them. Nip would take advantage of every stop to lay down. And then you see, some horse-drawn carriages and wagons, but you also see the cars. By this time, people were much more excited about the appearance and advent and now availability with the Model T of cars. And maybe somebody, if they had driven from state capital to state capital, they would have got some attention. But 4 men on horses, nobody really cared. The other big issue that I see that I've thought of is World War I. We entered that war in 1914. And much of the newspaper coverage would be about war news. The picture on my right shows a picture of the soldiers honoring the 9 million horses and mules that were killed during World War I. And I talk about, or I have Pinto talk about that with another horse. And the European armies were actually coming into the US before we even got involved in the war and trying to buy up horses because so many of their horses and mules had been killed in the war. And so I had found some pictures of some horses that were being lifted onto ships in a harness, lifted onto ships and shipped over to Europe. And as you know, they never came back. the horses that were shipped over there were either just turned loose in Europe or were adopted by people over there. But if they lived, they didn't come back. So World War I was going on, and that was of much more concern to people than 4 horsemen riding around the country. I did not find very much information about what happened to the overland Westerners after they completed their journey. I did find a little bit of information about George Beck. So the account of him being found dead in a drainage ditch, having drowned in a drainage ditch, apparently was true. But I did find one little snippet here in the papers that were up in the museum in Washington, and I'll read this to you. It says, long after Nip ended his dog span of life, Pinto, a Bainbridge Island pet, roamed the beach and shore lots, amusing the summer residents, particularly the summer kids, pilfering rural fire department mailboxes for loaves of bread left by obliging mailmen, and helping himself to sacks of grain from the general store's loading platform. A nuisance, still a beloved pet. Seemingly he did not share in the disappointment of the men he had served so well for over 3 years. He was satisfied to be home. He had suffered no ill effects from his arduous journey. A report which I have never heard denied states that Pinto finished up on the Olympic Peninsula, a pack animal for the U.S. Forest Service. I knew only as a Bainbridge Islander, toting kids and trampling lawns and flower beds and getting away with it. So it was that account that a woman had written that I used to conclude the story with Pinto arriving back home. Now, I did find that one of the men was married, and his wife actually put up with him being gone for 3 years. And he did go back to his wife, and he did have a child. But that was all I could find out about the 4 men after the journey. So this book was written for all of you. And I wrote, I leave it to you to remember us. And that's as though it's being said from Pinto's point of view. So
Yeah.
that is what I wanted to share with you about the background of the story behind the story, I call it, of Pinto. Now, this is a historical fiction, and the reason it's a fiction story is because even though most of the story is true, it was told from the horse's point of view, like Black Beauty. So Pinto tells the story of this arduous journey himself. And that's what puts it in the category of historical fiction. I am currently working on a second historical fiction. It's called The Sand Pounders.
Mm-hmm.
During World War II, the U.S. Coast Guard actually had, for 2 years, a mounted beach patrol. So I am writing a story now about the sand pounders and about a girl who wants to be a sand pounder but is told she can't do it. So it's kind of a Mulan story. She disguises herself as a boy and becomes a sand pounder. So I think historical fiction is a fun way to learn history, but it's also very much fun to write. The research into the time period or the event is really, really fun for me as an author.
Nice. Well, that is my favorite genre to read, actually, historical fiction. I've read, I don't even know how many books I've read of historical fiction. But so let's say again, I don't know if we said at the beginning of all this. So you're in Denver and you're writing this, and so you got to go around on these trips. You went to the 2 different libraries. And that second library just sounds like that was amazing.
It was amazing. It was so fun.
Get all that resources right there. That's awesome.
And you know, you mentioned your favorite genre is historical fiction. My favorite genre is fantasy. And
Ah,
I've written several fantasy books, most of them horse-based fantasy creatures like unicorns or centaurs. But the funny thing about writing fantasy, the fun thing is that you can just let your imagination go wild. With
hmm.
Pinto, I had to stay pretty true to the story,
Yeah,
and you couldn't just make things up. You know, the couple things I made up were to fit in with gaps, to fill in gaps that were in the story. But you had to stay pretty close to the story.
yeah, yeah. You have to be believable.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, the when you're you know, I'm a horsewoman. I live in just north of Parker in a little tiny town called Foxfield.
Hmm.
And I have my horses in my backyard. And I know a lot about horses, but I also love them. And that comes through in my writing. But you mentioned having to be believable. I think people enjoy my books because they know that I know horses and they know that I love horses. And so they can relate to that and they can feel some of my emotion in the books. I've
Yeah.
written 16 books, and all 14 of the 16 are about horses or horse. Like here's a copy of Pinto, but
Hmm.
most of the people in Elizabeth and surrounding areas, I'm really famous for the Riding Colorado Trail Guide books, which are my non
Ooh.
books. This is my brand new one that just came out in December, no, end of November,
Oh,
and
wow.
it's called Riding Colorado and Beyond. And
Nice.
I write my nonfiction books under the name Margie Evans. I write
Uh-huh.
my fiction books under the name M.J. Evans.
Okay.
So the Riding Colorado and Beyond is a fun book because I expanded Riding Colorado 3, which is overnight trips with your horse. Riding
Hmm.
Colorado and Beyond has 10 additional Colorado overnight trips, but it has 14 overnight trips in the surrounding states around
Oh,
Colorado.
nice.
So it just kind of expanded my journeys a little bit. So I think most of your um, people would know me for those books, at least the adults.
Yeah. Well, that's good. So our little library, we're in Simla, and the town itself is just kind of a small little couple streets back and forth kind of thing. But then there are several ranches around, and a lot of people will have cattle, and I don't know, I think maybe half of the folks with cattle still use horses to kind of go round up and stuff. And then the others have switched to four-wheelers. But that's our surroundings. I know we have some people that board horses and train horses and breed horses, and so this is great. The
I
the kids in our area are very familiar with interaction with horses, so this is great.
can tell your local school that I love to do author visits. I'm a former teacher of junior high and high school students, but I have
Nice.
fun presentations for fourth grade and up. And I don't charge. I just love to come be in the classroom with the kids.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Nice. That's awesome. I'm one of those weird people that likes to interact with the teenagers.
I love, me too. I love teenagers. That's why I taught junior high and high school. I love
Yeah,
teenagers. I think they're
yeah,
fun.
they are. They start asking the most interesting questions.
They do. Yeah, they're fun.
Yes. Okay. So we've heard about Pinto. That's a historical fiction, true story. So if people are interested to read more about that, they can Google and they can see and find the true facts that you've based your story on.
Yep.
And
And
then, do you have a website that they can go to?
uh-huh. My website is dancinghorsepress.com.
Okay.
Nancy,
And I will put that on our comments too.
be great. And I have on the website, they can see all my books. They've all won numerous national and international awards. Pinto, for example, has won 10 national and international awards. It's been very well received by not only the readers, but by the critics as well.
Right. Well, and like you mentioned a little while ago, it's similar to Black Beauty, but I don't remember if you said this while we were recording or before, I think because we were chatting ahead. But Black Beauty was written over in England much before the story of Pinto took place here in America. But it's in the same view, it's the horse telling you about his life.
Right.
And I think a lot of people would read that and kind of understand it, and it flows very well, I think.
Thank you. Well, I think if you loved Black Beauty, you would love Pinto.
Yeah, and I will second that. I think so too.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a very, very nice book. I think I read it in 2 or 3 evenings, but I got interrupted, as you know. So I think that's why it took me the 3 evenings. But I was just like, "Oh, this is so good."
I think it's a quick read.
Yeah, it was very good. So now I'm curious to read your other books. So I'll have to, and you said M.J. Evans for the historical fiction and Margie Evans for
Margie.
I'm sorry?
It's Margie with a hard G.
Oh, it's Margie. Oh, okay. Margie Evans for the nonfiction.
Uh-huh.
Nice.
Right.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, this is awesome.
Visiting with me today and letting me share with you the fun story of Pinto. I appreciate it.
I am so glad to do this too. It's a new way of getting our authors connected to the folks in our library, and we're just rolling with it.